Okay, we got everything set up, and we just introduced Heather.
And is the Webex on?
Oh,
I don't know.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. Okay, thanks. You're very good.
Okay,
Thank you. Good luck.
we're missing one presenter, but we're all good.
Yes. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so this presentation is not an empirical study. It's a sort of review of empirical studies. So just preview of things to come. So what we wanted to do here is essentially take a look at the kind of new body of rigorous land impact evaluations. And so we wanted to really focus on the counterfactual based studies, especially those that have been coming out over the past 10 years or so. And we wanted to essentially take a look at this body of literature, a very sort of set sample for like counterfactual studies, especially those that are some of the new studies. These don't have to be academic publications. These can be just donor reports, and look at these in a way that some review studies don't look at them. So essentially, we really wanted to dig into the context, right? So we wanted to read in between the lines of what happened on the ground, how was the implementation fidelity, how was the enabling context, what exactly was the intervention doing, right? So instead of just saying formalization, like what exactly was happening, and was this overlapping with other interventions, et cetera. The other thing we wanted to do was look at this across all of the outcomes for the global land logic model. So essentially, we took the theory of change that Jenny has worked on for many years, and that many people now use as part of land evaluation. And we wanted to look at these studies and track their findings across any of the outcomes that they explored across the impact evaluation. So instead of just looking at investment or tenure security, we wanted to see what outcomes they studied and what their findings were for each of those outcomes. So that was the goal of the review. And so when we sort of dug into what was available, we ended up with 26 experimental and quasi-experimental land tenure and land governance impact evaluations. I will say that there are probably 2 or 3 more, at least, that need to be added to this based on things that have been published or come out in the past couple of months, including, this doesn't include like the Uganda evaluation that we're working on with Daniel and Taya. So there's some more that can be added to this. Also, I was hoping as part of this conference that there might even be more that like come out that can be added to this. But essentially we honed in on this particular paper on 26. Again, these needed to be a land-related intervention or land reform that measured socioeconomic outcomes. So not just uptake of documentation or, but needed to really actually look at sort of, and not just an environmental outcome. So we have a body of literature that deals with conservation outcomes as well, but this is really, we're looking at socioeconomic outcomes. And then it needed to be a counterfactual based study, so either experimental or quasi-experimental design, and it needed to have a credible counterfactual based group. So it needed to have a good, solid comparison group. So this eliminates the cross-sectional studies, things like this. There are no qualitative studies in here. We classified studies across a number of areas. So again, we went through the kind of the global land logic model that I put up earlier and looking at different outcomes across, from knowledge and awareness to tenure security to land rights to investment, all the way through. Whatever the study presented on, we looked at that. We also looked at the intervention type. Was this systematic registration? Was it sporadic registration? Was this legal reform? Again, was this an integrated program with an agricultural component? We looked at the context. Are we talking about rural, urban, or peri-urban? Because those are very different. Are we talking about customary, like sort of new formalization in customary areas? Are we talking about state-owned property? What exactly are we talking about for land governance? And then we also focused on the treatment level, the exposure period, and the implementation fidelity. This is important because treatment level, looking at individual level property rights versus communal or communities is very different. So again, we tried to kind of break that out. And then we wanted to see sort of how well the program was implemented, or if there were any discussions of challenges with regards to the implementation, right? So a systematic registration program doesn't necessarily mean that everyone actually ends up getting registered. So kind of what is the coverage and what were the challenges? So across the study, we have the general sample overview. Most of the studies ended up being titling. So most of these were systematic land registration projects. That's 18 out of our 26. And so this is not surprising because it can be easier to study sort of from an impact evaluation context, a titling program, right? Most of these are in Africa for the geography. Most of them covered rural areas. Most of them dealt with individual level titling. Out of the ones we looked at, most of them did talk about the implementation fidelity, like the sort of challenges on the ground. And then we also looked at sort of, did they study gender or differential effects? And about half of the sample did study gender or differential effects. The extent to which that was done in like a causal framework varied. Exposure period. So these are kind of the list of studies. Because we only have 20 minutes for the presentation, I don't go through every single study, but you can kind of get a sense of the studies through this picture. So the exposure periods varied, and that was one of the good things from kind of the new body of evaluations coming in, because many of them are looking at longer term exposure periods. There's been questions about how long it will take for different effects to be seen. And so this is the exposure period kind of from when the treatment sort of was implemented or came into being, if you will, to when the end line measure was taken. So we have a range there. This again is the kind of summary table, and what I just want to highlight here is how diverse the sample is, okay? So across the types of contexts, the levels that the treatment happened at, the categories of the interventions, the land types that are being intervened upon, if you will, and then the exposure period, you can see the tremendous amount of diversity. And so why does this matter? This matters because when you have broad sweeping statements about the impact of a program, and when you have, kind of synthesizing the literature in sort of a very parsimonious way, you're missing out on all of this that's happening, right? And so these are very diverse studies. They cover a very big range of contexts, and the outcomes across all of them also vary significantly. All of that is to say that the standard takeaway for researchers, more evidence is needed, and to just kind of be careful in terms of sort of the takeaways about particular interventions, whether work or not work, sort of language doesn't actually work, if you will. Okay, so I'm going to talk about just two of the outcome indicators across the global land logic model. I'm not going to go into all of them because we only have like 10 more minutes, right? So, but if you're interested in this, the paper goes through all of them. So if you're interested in seeing a summary of credit findings and this and that, that's what this paper does. But here's just tenure security, because everyone is interested in tenure security, right? That's a focus. So these are studies, whether or not they present a measure of perceived tenure security, and then the sort of like findings according to the study. So, kind of however you want to take away from these results, but what you can actually see is like a number of studies still aren't or haven't reported, right, this perceived tenure security. So this is supposed to be like the binding constraint. This is like what we're working towards changing. We have many studies that study an outcome, but they don't actually measure this beforehand, right? There's this assumption that tenure security has changed, but either we have null results or not reporting. We do have a body of literature growing here that does present it, and we do have some positive findings. But that is all to say that, like, the methodologies are getting better, they're getting stronger, but there's still some gaps here. Here's investment. Again, we want to study this link between tenure security and investment. So while more studies present the investment side, they're not always including the perceived tenure security side, if you will. And here's kind of the range of what we're seeing. So we see negative results, we see positive results, we see more studies with positive results, yes. We also see our null and not reported results. So there's, there's diversity across the outcome. Okay, so what happens when you kind of line these up, right, against like the land logic model? If you take the studies that present both perceived tenure security and, let's say, measured investment, again, the paper does more outcomes, but I'm just doing an example here. It's hard to find a pattern, right? It's hard to say, oh, when we study this type of project, we find, this clear pattern. When we study, this other type of project, there's clearly like a negative result happening. There's a lot of variation, right? We find cases where we have an increase in perceived tenure security, but that did not follow with improvements in investment. We have studies where we have negative investment coming after a null tenure security. So we don't always get the green, right? And sometimes we get the green and no change. Does that make sense to people? So anyways, again, all of this is kind of important for how we're thinking about the studies and what we're seeing and where we're trying to find patterns in terms of like designing better programs. Oh, wow.
Sorry to interrupt. I just
No,
got
that
a
was
call about a broken camera, and I think normally that happens when the lights are off.
okay.
So we should all be good. Sorry to interrupt.
No. And then I think, the other thing that we found is, as you can see, going, back to sort of the bigger study frame here, and then going back down to this number of studies that study both perceived tenure security and investment, it's only a subsample, right? So we have like, not all studies that have, kind of measured key outcomes across the theory of change, right? So this is improving in evaluations as you go through time, but it's still a limitation in terms of the body of evidence, at least for impact evaluations where you have all of these things measured. And then the last kind of implementation, fidelity, and sustainability. These issues don't receive equal treatment across studies. That's probably not surprising to you guys. The donor-funded studies often do a much better job of providing this information in the reports, as opposed to like an academic paper where you get maybe a footnote or no information. So findings in terms of like what we see with regards to improvements over time. General improvements in methods, more counterfactual studies coming out, more indicators that align with measuring perceived tenure security or are sort of vetted through prior studies, if you will. Data quality is improving. There are a number of studies that have increased the use of different data sources, right? So we have now studies that are integrating household surveys with geospatial, with land administration data. So we've gotten a lot more comprehensive in our data sources. And then we've also got, again, the sort of longer term exposure period studies that are coming out now, which provide a lot of helpful information. And then gender differential effects, that's been, increasingly integrated into studies. We're still missing a number of kind of panel studies or studies where we can really look at the impact on gender. That's changing, but that's still sort of a gap. There's a number of cross-sectional studies that are doing this, but because these sort of spousal studies or intra-household studies are relatively new, we still don't have quite the same amount of data to work with. In terms of lesson for land policy and evaluation, again, there's quite a lot of variety in the sample, so we need more studies so that we can really say like, okay, looking at a customary situation, these sorts of interventions, are working, et cetera. And also diversification of the interventions under evaluation. So again, most of the studies are of titling, but we have a number of land sector interventions that deal with strengthening customary rights through different mechanisms, or that are not necessarily focused on titling per se, or titling within a formalization context. So looking at those interventions as well. Verifying key assumptions during due diligence. So, looking at sort of the enabling context and making sure that you're using the baseline data for impact evaluations and looking at the assumptions underlying the theory of change to really kind of interrogate those issues during project design. And then I think the other thing that kind of came out as a finding was, in many cases, the lack of sort of project documentation about what happened in terms of implementation or even where projects are implemented. So this is still a problem for, projects keeping that sort of M&D data or output data on where exactly an intervention is happening, what happened in that particular community or village. In many instances, the kind of evaluation teams have to kind of go back and recreate and find all of that. And so I think, there's still a need for good record keeping about just the basics of the implementation of where, what, and who got these interventions. And then I think we talked about the differential treatment effects, how that's getting better, but there's still a need to continue, looking at the gender aspects. And then for tracking additional outcomes, this is again making sure that, if you're going to focus a study on investment, your core should still measure the perceived tenure issues if that's, looking at the right outcomes for the binding constraints in your study. I think I did this in 8:20. All right, one minute. That's it. Okay.
Thank you, Heather.
Yeah.
And the chair, I'm going to just take the opportunity also to just say a bit from the policy side, because I switched over from the evaluation back into the operations side. I think, one thing to think about this study is that your implementation fidelity in the exposure period was very important. So usually the contacts told you why something did or didn't happen. So you had cases, for example, where titles weren't issued till the very, very end of a project, or a subset of those titles were issued, right? So if you thought you were going to issue 100,000 titles or 1 million titles, and that's what the project was geared to do and evaluated to do, yet it only in the fact issued, let's say, 5,000 titles, right? Some of those evaluations still found effects, right? They were just much smaller, right? So looking at how your project is actually implemented, and the ability of the evaluation to have enough power to find an effect was quite interesting. Or cases where you had credit effects. So, if you don't have, I think one of the findings was, as you've seen in some of the other research, if there's not, if the financial side isn't a binding constraint, then it's not going to have an effect, right? So you had cases, for example, where credit markets increased drastically in certain cases, and that was simply because it was a binding constraint. It was a more urban area or peri-urban area or an access to credit issue. On the agricultural side, I think there were cases, for example, and I haven't gone back to the paper in quite a while, but if I recall correctly, there were issues, for example, in Ghana, one of the studies that's presented, the thought was, okay, you're going to have an increase in rural investment because it was in farms, when in fact it was really close to Accra. So why didn't they invest in rural agriculture? Because it was a growing peri-urban area. So they moved and did all farm labor instead of agriculture. And I think one of the things to think about is, when you're an evaluator, are you evaluating what the project originally intended to do, or do you look at all these intricacies that are going on the operational side, right? There can still be, there's reasons why you're getting your impacts that were predicted or not, and the question is, how can you best portray that? How can you find that? How can you understand that? So from a policy side, and somebody who's doing development in land and trying to understand what are the best projects to implement, we understand those lessons rather than just yes or no, the project failed, null or negative result, or got a positive result. And at least on my case, I'm not, when Heather and I were looking through the evaluations, it was really hard to find consistency across the evaluations where you looked at all those different issues. And I think this is one of the first ones that tried to look at not just yes or no, like a kind of a systematic review that said, yes, there's a positive result, or no, there's a negative result, but really looked at why. Was it an issue of an exposure period? Was it an issue of implementation fidelity? Was it because, the logic itself was wrong, which is what's usually looked at in some of these evaluations. And I think as an evaluation community, if we can go back to looking at some of those aspects, it would really help from a policy side when you're trying to inform policy makers, what's the best thing to invest in. But thank you so much, Heather. Let's open it up to questions. You can't escape yet, Heather, because we're gonna give you a Q&A. I'm going to open up to questions for about 5 minutes or so, and then we can move to the next presentation. Questions. All right. Everyone's so shy today.
I have a quick question. Thanks so much. It's very interesting to see this literature review, and even in the Latin American context where I work, there were some studies I wasn't aware of, so it's interesting to see that more has been done than I've seen. My question was with regards to when you showed that table, kind of seeing the 10-year security, if a positive result had been reported, and then for investment, where there was consistency, on both, we found some positive results. Was it possible to extract any sort of lessons learned on the projects that did work, like what they did right, that could be sort of, I don't know if generalized, but shared?
One of the sort of patterns was, if you call it a pattern with such a small number, was when you did have 10-year security plus the agricultural programs that were there to relieve the constraint of resources or access to inputs, then you tended to find the perceived 10-year security increase and the agricultural investment increase, which makes sense, right? Because why are they not investing? Because they don't have enough money to invest. And so land is not necessarily always the binding constraint. It's that they don't have enough money to do this. So in some of the, especially the donor evaluations where they had the integrated ag and land, and we're looking at this, then that was kind of more likely to show the green.
A lot of the RCTs are land plus ag, right? So I think, Jill's here, a lot of these embed, a lot of these are MCC evaluations that did the RCTs that were led by the World Bank or NORC, Gender Innovation Lab or NORC or whoever, right, Mathematica. So when you look at and I think the same thing came across when you do some of the environmental analysis, it's not just land, but land plus agriculture.
Meaning that they provided other services to farmers?
Right, a combined effect, right? So land isn't necessary. I think when we did this presentation, a year or so ago during COVID, it was, the land is a necessary foundation, right, to get this through. In some cases, you can see land as the catalyst for some of these actions. But oftentimes you need land plus ag or land plus the environmental services to actually have the effect, right? And I think that happens both ways, right? When you're looking at some of these projects, and it's really hard when you do a joint agriculture, irrigation, land project to kind of separate out those effects without really good qualitative data as well. But I think overall, that's kind of the lesson that's coming out of a lot of these evaluations is you need a combined set of investments in a lot of these cases.
Thank you.
Sandra, I'm wondering if your results make you change your theory of change or adjust it in some way.
I know, she's brought that up too. The theory of change was, to give you some background, was drafted in consultation with different research community members as well as development partners. And so it was based on not just the quant literature, but also the qualitative findings and where people were seeing or thought to see results. So I think these are expected findings. And in the theory of change, it actually says, look, some of these may not happen for second and third, right? Or some of these might happen at different levels. So there were certain things that were expected to be found in the short term, medium term, and long term. And in fact, some things were happening much sooner and some things much longer. So, there's questions on whether perception of tenure, how good of a measure that is, right? It can change, you have a fight with your husband, how you view it might change that day. Or you might need to invest to have increased tenure security. So there's where these things fall along the chain, I think isn't as important as having all those different issues listed, that we're looking at not only land equals rural agricultural investment and credit, but looking at a combined set of activities, because a lot of times evaluations are only looking at the rural side, but not looking at off farm, because you can't measure everything. You can't track everything, but we need to look at a broader set of investments in order to really get at how land is affecting. You give somebody security of title, they may not want to stay as a farmer. They may want to move off. They may not use a formal credit market. They may instead use, build up their own resources and actually invest. So you don't see the credit equals investment. You see people saving up on their own and do that. And you hear that when you go and you get that qualitative data and link it in, but it's not quite clear from the literature. So I think as evaluators, we really need to look at what's, we often make these broad sweeping statements, and that's affecting policymakers, right? On whether they decide to invest or not. So I think we need to go back and just think about a little bit more like to give a better explanation to policymakers of why these things are happening or not, and what's happening in the background that could be affecting that certain investment.
Yeah, I have a question. So in different countries, there will be different instruments, and some of them not necessarily meant to increase tenure security, for example. I saw that you use, for example, Brazil CAR studies. CAR was proposed in theory or in our legislation to increase tenure security. It doesn't mean people can perceive that. So did you make an assessment of whether or not the instrument was actually meant to achieve some of the indicators that you were interested in?
So we didn't have access to all of the actual instruments that were used to measure the outcomes on the ground. But instead it was based on whether the study noted that tenure security was an objective and whether or not the study actually measured tenure security. And so for this one, for example, they don't measure tenure security because I assume, this is not. But the papers note that that is an objective and that is the theory of change behind the outcomes that they're looking at. So that's part of like the document or the figure that shows that in a number of these studies, there's kind of an assumption that some outcome is going to happen, and there's an assumption again that the intervention is going to lead to a change in tenure security as part of what's going to direct that. But the study doesn't actually measure that. It doesn't have any. It's kind of like a black box sort of moment, right? Where you have there's an intervention. I'm going to assume it's going to change this outcome. I'm going to look at the intervention and the outcome, and then there's all the stuff in the middle. But there are no measures on those. So I think that's an area where studies have gotten better in terms of actually including measures for those sort of things. But this is like one of I'd say the earlier studies, and it wasn't the kind of focused land sector study. Yeah. But we did include several of those studies that did that because they did fit the box of having a counterfactual, doing it in a rigorous way, having an intervention that was supposed to change tenure as part of the objective, and then they did, measure some socioeconomic outcomes. That makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Just then in some cases the instrument itself, but is not really supposed to deal with tenure security. That's not why it was created. But so I'm guessing whether if the studies want to measure that. Based on CAR, maybe it's a question of should they do that, or it's more about the perception of people who receive CAR because maybe they perceive it as being an instrument for land security, but it's not in reality. I mean, so it's more like a question of what is the legal value of that specific document that is being given.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a good point. I think CAR also though led to, I mean, if you look at the environmental studies around CAR, right? I mean, you see changes based on the implementation of CAR in Brazil. And so I think the question is then what's driving those investment changes? Or sustainability, like decreases in deforestation and things like that. And so some of this also is to measure like what's driving that, right? Is it tenure? Is it something else? But I think you make a good point in terms of, okay, what was the instrument originally designed to do versus what are we evaluating it as now, right? And I think that's a good point that can be looked at in the future. I am going to move on only because it's 8:33 and we'll have some time at the end maybe to go back as well if people want to do a set of questions. But we're going to introduce Ben Linko, who's on a paper on lessons learned from MCC evaluation. So Ben, I'd like to invite you to come to the front. Ben has a very short bio that he's a development microeconomist working in the land sector and on research and evaluation, but I'm going to augment that. So so Ben Linko has also been doing, similar to Heather Huntington, has been doing land evaluations and economics for quite some time, working in both MCC's economics department before he moved over to the land shop. He also worked with USAID, Ohio, NORC. Am I missing anything in between? Oh, Vanessa, I'm sorry. So Ben has jumped between operations and evaluations, but always from an economics point of view, and has done a paper on lessons learned from MCC land evaluations. And Millennium Challenge Corporation is one of the few of the donors who has been investing in evaluations across all its projects, including land projects, and has led some of the only randomized controlled trials in land, along with USAID. So Ben, I'll leave it to you to take us away. You have 20 minutes.
Okay, try to stick to time. Thanks, Jenny. So this is kind of a neat segue from the last presentation, which was also focused on synthesizing the literature. A couple of differences I would highlight about this one. This is more narrowly focused on MCC's particular projects and evaluations and MCC's experiences with those. And then also this one is looking at not only impact evaluations, but also performance evaluations. So it's a little bit of a different approach in that sense. So let me start with some background. The Millennium Challenge Corporation is a U.S. government agency established in 2004 with a mission to promote poverty reduction through economic growth. MCC has always had a strong commitment to independent evaluation, and as of 2007, I believe, independent evaluations are required of all MCC projects. MCC does these 5-year compacts, large grants that look to address constraints to growth in a range of sectors, with land and property rights being an important sector that MCC has invested in since the beginning of the agency. Over the 20-year history of MCC, there's been 15 independent evaluations of land projects, and 3 more are in progress, 15 completed. And so that's a good opportunity to kind of take stock and look at what we've learned from 20 years of land programming. And that's the motivation for this lessons learned from MCC land evaluations paper. I do want to stress that this is a work in progress. These are preliminary findings only. But the objective here is to synthesize findings from these evaluations and then identify lessons for future land programming and land evaluations, both at MCC and elsewhere. And just an overview of how the presentation will go. I'll start off by talking about MCC's land programs and evaluations, and then synthesis of the findings. I'll go through those pretty quickly so that we can focus more on the lessons learned from MCC's land evaluations. So this is MCC's land portfolio. MCC's invested over $500 million in land projects throughout its history. You can see there's a range of geographies. So there have been 16 MCC compacts that have included land programs, and then also 5 threshold programs, which are smaller grant programs that MCC does to help countries become eligible for compacts. And I want to highlight there are 4 sort of categories of interventions that are in the graphic there that reflect the kinds of interventions that MCC does. One you can see is institutional strengthening, and that's things like training for land administration officials, establishing land information systems, upgrading equipment and facilities, things like that. Then formalization of land rights, which can be done in rural, peri-urban, or urban contexts. And that's, I think we're all familiar with mapping, adjudication, registration of land rights, issuing land titles or other property documents. And then finally, a lot of MCC's projects include legal policy and regulatory reform in the form of convening stakeholder dialogues, drafting proposed legal changes, and then legislative advocacy for the proposed changes. Now, just to talk about the evaluations, as I mentioned, MCC requires third-party evaluations of all projects. And so for these 15 land evaluations, there's sort of 3 different methodological approaches. 4 of them are impact evaluations, where multiple rounds of quantitative survey data and a counterfactual to measure causal impacts of the program. 6 of them are performance evaluations that use qualitative data collection analysis. Some also use descriptive data or administrative data, or some small surveys, but they don't use a counterfactual design. And then the third category is evaluations that combine both methods, using some to address some evaluation questions and other methods to address other evaluation questions. There's a couple of evaluations also that have incorporated remote sensing data and measures of rangeland quality, but generally we're focused on survey data, qualitative and quantitative survey data, and administrative data. And you can see it's a relatively even breakdown across the 3 types of methods. So for our synthesis of the findings, we include 10 of these 15 evaluations. Some of them are not structured in a way that make for good comparison with the others. A couple of them combine irrigation and land programs, and so the evaluation doesn't distinguish between the impacts of the irrigation project and the land project, so those aren't really comparable to the other ones. And then there's a couple other that sort of don't fit for various reasons, but these are the 10 that we're left with. You can see a range of geographies, 4 performance evaluations, 3 impact evaluations, and 3 mixed methods. And the exposure periods in the last column there range from 2 to 3 years in one case, 4 to 6 in most cases, and then one that was between 9 and 11 years. Okay, so in terms of synthesizing the findings here, this framework characterizes what the evaluations are trying to measure, and it's sort of the program, a loose program logic that fits the body of evaluations as a whole pretty well. I should emphasize that this is not necessarily MCC's current thinking about land program logics or the relevant outcomes to measure. This is just when we look at these evaluations, what have they done? So in the outputs category, legal policy and regulatory reforms, short-term outcomes include perceived tenure security, quality efficiency of land services, and then in the medium term, investment, land market activity, transactions, and land values, access to credit, conflict incidents, and then in the long term, agricultural production and productivity, and household income and assets. A couple of other aspects that kind of fall outside of this program logic that have been important emphases are looking at gender differentiated impacts in women's empowerment, and then also sustainability of outputs, and particularly land information systems as an important focus there, and whether those were sustained over time after the project. Okay, so here's our synthesis of findings. We have the scale that's shown there in the upper right, characterizing the evidence for each category and each evaluation as either no evidence of impact, two different categories of mixed evidence of impact, and then another category of strong impact. And looking across, we have outputs over on the left. Relatively strong findings on outputs, but some gaps there. You can see at the top that not all of the evaluations looked at outputs, and I'll get back to that later. Moving over to the outcomes, generally positive results on tenure security and quality efficiency of land services. So tenure security, we had strong findings in the Ghana LT case, mixed but mainly strong findings in the next four there, mixed but weak findings in Lesotho LARP and Mozambique LTS, and then no evidence of improved tenure security on the top two there, Burkina Faso LG and Indonesia BLUP. You'll notice as we go to the right, we start to see less and less strong evidence. Particularly investment is very weak. No cases of strong evidence there, and over half the evaluations found no evidence. And then looking at the long-term outcomes on the right, Ghana LT was the only one where we have a strong finding on a long-term economic outcome. Otherwise, either no evidence or weak mixed evidence. So a couple of things to highlight about the synthesis there. One, and this gets to something that Jenny was talking about, assessments of outputs and implementation in these evaluation reports tend to be limited. There were very few cases of evaluations that actually explicitly compared outputs to targets. Some of them didn't report on outputs at all. And that makes it a little bit difficult to interpret the findings in some cases. And that relates to another point I want to make about, how do we get a finding of strong evidence, right? It's not just a function of a program that was effective, right? It's the confluence of a few different factors, right? One is the assumptions of the program logic, right? We have to have a program logic that was sound and correctly anticipating what the impacts were going to be. Secondly, we have to have project implementation that was effective, right? So the project needs to be implemented in the way that was anticipated and that the program logic had assumed would be what would lead to the impact. And then finally, the evaluation has to be effective, right? The evaluation methods have to be sound. We have to avoid compromise to the design. And all of these three things have to happen at once in order to get an evaluation that has strong evidence. In looking at these, the MCC evaluations and some of these impact evaluations, it's difficult to identify which of those things is the explanation. And in a lot of cases, we see several of them happening. There's evaluations where control groups were contaminated to some extent, other cases where projects weren't implemented as planned. And so it's really difficult to draw out lessons as cleanly as we would like without being able to identify what the source of the null findings is. Okay, and then just Very briefly on gender and sustainability, we tended to see a lot of gender differentiation impacts on perceived tenure security, both positive and negative. We also saw 2 evaluations where there were impacts on women's labor allocation. In those, strengthening land rights was enabling women to stop devoting resources to protecting their property rights and devoting their labor to more productive pursuits. That was a benefit of the project. And then a few of the evaluations looked at intra-household bargaining power with mixed results. In terms of sustainability, generally positive findings overall. One point that comes out is that the sustainability of land information systems benefits from introducing them early in the project. We had a couple of cases where things fell behind schedule and the land information system was set up later than anticipated. And without the time for troubleshooting and training and really getting it going and kind of iterating on it a couple of times, there were issues with sustainability. Okay. Getting into the lessons. So I guess we're low on time, so I'll just go through these fairly quickly. One that comes out is that these household level impacts that can be directly measured by evaluations can't fully capture the link between strengthening property rights and economic growth. Just to summarize, we often look for these kind of micro level stories where we're strengthening tenure security, we're improving agricultural productivity for smallholders, and we're going to be able to observe that as an outcome. But those things can be difficult to measure, and I think it's important to highlight that they're not the only justification for land projects, right? I think, it's kind of universally agreed that functioning property rights system is a necessary condition for economic growth at a certain point. And even if property rights aren't the binding constraint now, we know they will be at some point. And there's not really an argument against that. And so I think in terms of kind of justifying our programs to policymakers, it may be more compelling to emphasize those broader economic arguments rather than focusing too much on the micro level evidence. Second lesson that comes out is project design should not assume demand for formalization will materialize when where there's apparent need or interest. We saw this in a couple of projects. One case in Lesotho, respondents indicated that tenure security was not something that was deterring them from making investments in housing. We also saw a couple of cases where project documents or land documents were expected to be issued after the compact. It didn't happen because the impetus wasn't there. We also see that outreach and sensitization campaigns can have an important impact on increasing interest and spurring demand. A third lesson, avoid project designs that are overly ambitious in terms of complexity, scale, or need for coordination across sectors. A lot of these projects turned out to be more challenging to implement than expected. This is particularly relevant to MCC, given that MCC's projects have a strict 5-year project time limit, but also to other projects as well. And an important point here is that when you end up having to revise your scope and you're not able to implement the project at the scale or depth that you wanted to, that can lead to arbitrary prioritization and just kind of implementing what you can in the time you have, rather than what would have been optimal to implement given the constraints. And that comes out in the point I was raising earlier about training and troubleshooting for land information systems. Now turning to lessons for land evaluations. So one, again, getting to what Jenny was talking about, evaluations should always include a thorough assessment of actual outputs and implementation. And in order to do that, projects should devote attention to compiling administrative and project data for evaluations during implementation. As I mentioned, very few of these evaluations were able to explicitly compare outputs to targets. But when they were, and when there were findings that related to outputs, these were often quite useful to staff at MCC and told them things that they hadn't, that they didn't know about, documents that weren't issued and things like that. It's, getting back to the earlier discussion about how do we interpret null impact evaluation findings, understanding implementation issues can be essential for explaining what findings we're seeing on outcomes, not just outputs, and not just for, we're not just looking at this for the sake of implementation. And then the last point on that, MCC's recently revised evaluation policy now includes, was the project implemented as planned, as one of two evaluation questions that evaluations will focus on, and so that should go some way towards increasing the emphasis on implementation. Third lesson for land evaluations, though necessary for measuring economic outcomes, these long exposure periods can entail substantial risks and limitations, and in determining the appropriate exposure period for an evaluation, trade-offs should be considered. The point here is that if we want to measure these economic outcomes, we do need long exposure periods. I think the literature is clear on that. But when we do that, that comes at a cost to other aspects of the evaluation. It also introduced risks, attrition, contamination. Those risks can become high and costly to mitigate, and can reduce the utility of the evaluation in other ways. And then finally, impact evaluation should incorporate qualitative components following preliminary quantitative analysis. We don't want to discourage rigorous impact evaluations. They're very important for building the evidence base. But something that comes out in how these evaluation results were used is that quantitative estimates of impact alone are often difficult to explain and interpret. And also when we've seen impact evaluation include qualitative components, they tend to do data collection simultaneously rather than sequentially. Whereas impact evaluations would really benefit from kind of a preliminary quantitative analysis and then a follow-up qualitative exercise to try to explain the findings and answer the key questions that come out of the findings. So that's it. This is just kind of a recap of the 7 lessons. I'll leave that up and thank you and turn it over to questions.
Thanks, Ben. Interesting to see where the MCC lessons learned paper ended. I think you bring some good points in terms of the importance of administrative and project data, and I think that's one of the things that MCC and others are kind of moving forward to, is trying to get the geospatial data and the administrative data, even when you can't get impact evaluation data or household survey data. A lot of things can be told from the administrative and project data side, especially when it comes to understanding what outputs were actually provided, that when we depend on project records often isn't available or isn't as good a quality as you can get when you have some of the administrative data. So we have about 5 or 10 minutes for questions that we can do. I'll open up the floor.
Okay. Yeah, so I agree with many things. So for the investment issue and I fully agree that we shouldn't hold everything to this investment because it's not moving. But you mentioned, not a strong focus on that. I will say that's such a strong focus though for the people that are trying to leverage that to get these funded. So what other things could we measure that might indicate and justify land programming if we are shifting away from the investment piece?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of a question of getting away from the argument that we need empirical evidence of micro level impacts to justify what we're doing, and more to look at the broader picture and say, okay, we know we need to fix the property rights system in order for the economy to develop, beyond a certain point. If we wait until that's the binding constraint, that's when there's going to be conflict. That's when it's going to be more politically difficult, right? And so there's a powerful argument for doing it while there's space to do it, and not sort of waiting until it is the binding constraint. And then we might, when it is the binding constraint, we might see some of those micro level impacts, right? But I guess it's a question of more emphasizing the broader role of property rights in development and less the micro level impacts that we could expect to see from these programs. Not to say that we shouldn't still think about that and still, talk about that, but I think there's an argument for making the broader case more prominent than it is sometimes.
I think there's also, and I'll jump to the other two questions. I think there's also the question of how to measure some of these. Like, I'm not sure the case is necessarily that you don't have impacts in some of these. It's also a question of whether you can measure these. So like conflict, when you're looking at a lot of, and sorry, I came from 15 years doing bench jobs, so appropriately. One of the issues was like, and Heather led some of these evaluations as well, so it's interesting to see the back and forth, but like, there just wasn't enough power to capture conflict. I mean, conflict is one of the main issues, right? And, how many conflicts are actually formal conflicts that you can do? Or if you take a random sample of people in a household survey, right? How many of those are actually going to have a major land conflict? And then trying to evaluate them after as well, especially when probably most of this is like avoidance. And if you have one land conflict with somebody and you capture it, are they actually going to have, 5 years later, it's really hard to measure that sort of thing. So I'm not sure, like, whether you go with, maybe we shouldn't be measuring investment, or we shouldn't be measuring conflict, or we should be measuring other things and just accept land is good. I think some of it may also be, look, it is extremely hard to measure some of these benefit streams the way that we are measuring it now without looking at some other data that might be able to show that. Eventually show we can measure it in different ways that land does have benefits. And I'm sorry, I'm interrupting question here, so please go ahead.
So,
and introduce yourself. Sorry, I forgot that.
Mark Fabri, associate professor of economics, University of Bologna. I'm mostly familiar with one of the interventions that you described, one in the beginning. It was actually the first or second in the MCC history. Something that was always a little bit problematic for me was the 5-year plan, the compact. And I see that it lasted through all this kind of format. It lasted also for other intervention. Don't you think that's something that really jeopardized the possibility of this program implemented the proper way, as you would say, is that the 5-year time period is not fitting the political needs and legislative needs of the form.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about that internally at MCC. It's, there's arguments for it and against it. Ultimately, it's part of the legislation that created MCC, so it's not something that can just be sort of changed as a matter of policy. I think it's also, we can also think about it that if we have 5 years, we need to be realistic about what we can do in that time frame also. And so, some of the problems that happened with the earlier programs were, it would have been better if they could have been more than 5 years. It also would have been better if they could have been more realistic about what could have been done in 5 years.
Because that was not what you can do, is what the politicians in the city country can do in 5 years of changing the law that affects land tenures.
I mean, this also got brought up. I mean, the bank is the same way, right? I mean, it's 5-year projects that get extended on. A lot of donors have set amounts of projects, but what's happened is people have built on it. So the Benin project was started by AFG with the PFR, the Conseiller Rural, right? It's going back. It's being extended again through World Bank efforts and through AFD. So I think it's more like this back and forth that happens, right? There are baby steps to get some of the legal, institutional, and policy reforms, like things that actually make a difference, right? The change in minister's signature on every single secondary transaction in Lesotho sparked mortgages and transactions, and much more so than the systematic titling effort or the Married Persons Equality Act, right? or in Burkina's case and in some of these rural agricultural places, people couldn't even have a land certificate, right? And it's the first time that they're getting a land certificate in some of these cases. And I think, Heather and I discussed that in the paper as well. So when you look at that, and then you look at the next scale, 5 years later, somebody tries to pilot that or roll that out large scale, then you start to see effects. So I think some of this is, yes, you can do something in a short time frame, like you make a policy change, you first time recognize title, you move the ball forward, but it's something that's like 20, 30 years, and no donor is going to move. No donor is going to say, yes, we're signing off on a 30-year project, right? It's more like we each do incremental changes.
No, but the impact evaluation needs to take into account that it's 20 years.
Correct, yeah. And just to give you an idea, Mozambique, they've actually extended it, right? So there was a case where Gender Innovation Lab is taking it forward. In Benin, the same thing happened where they did large scale. So if you have a funder who will take the evaluation the next step and look at 10 years or 15 years, that's the key, right? It's not the project implementation as much as the gender. Great point.
Just really quickly, so kind of early.
Sorry, introduce yourself.
Oh, yes, sorry. My name's Matt Rebar. I'm a PhD candidate in political science at Stanford. Early on, and I should say my first job out of college was also as a contract impact evaluator for Mathematica, so it's nice to see this again. Early on, you mentioned that you wanted to, for the moment, set aside the paired land tenure and irrigation kind of evaluations just for the sake of getting like a clean comparison and trying to really distill some lessons. I'm wondering if you include all of these together and kind of have a noisier set of lessons, do you think the results change at all, or do you think you can still distill the same lessons?
I mean, there's only two that are irrigation and land. The problem is that there's no way to distinguish between the effects of the irrigation part and the land part. So those evaluations both show, or at least one of them showed very positive impacts, but on things like agricultural productivity, but no way to say how much of that was because of the irrigation, how much of that was because of the property rights. So it's difficult to say, how including those would change, what we found.
And Mathematica did try to do that. I don't know if that's the one you're referencing. Mathematica did try to do that in the Burkina MCC evaluation, right? And pull the Burkina or Senegal, sorry. Senegal, sorry. No, at this point. In Senegal's evaluation where they did try to pull it out, I think there were issues in trying to pull it out. And then you have land projects like these other ones that are still land ag irrigation, even if the project itself isn't implementing it. So they're land on an irrigated perimeter, like in Morocco's case that Mathematica also worked on, right? So again, this is why I'm saying, like, I think one of the cases is you have to look at the context a lot to try to figure this out, and that's why the data is so noisy, right? And it's hard to put these all together and give a policy recommendation unless you understand the noise.
Maya Schling, I'm a senior economist at the Inter-American Development Bank. I had a quick question, more, I guess, operative, since you were able to compare so many of MCC's evaluations. Do you apply across the board sort of a similar evaluation guidelines in terms of like the indicators to use and sort of basic requirements that have to follow some sort of guideline?
Not really. I think, so there's a new evaluation policy that's a little more prescriptive, I think, than it used to be. But, this has been over 20 years, and different people have been involved, different priorities have been involved. So, I mean, you could say certainly MCC emphasizes impact evaluations and emphasizes, quantitative analysis, and then also the evaluation questions, usually like previous evaluations, are being used as a starting point for those. Mm-hmm. So there's certainly kind of common threads, but there's not really a standard standard approach, although Jenny may have.
We can get into indicators, but no. I think actually, considering the time, we're gonna move on to Maya. Let's get run a round of applause. So now we're going to move on to, I think, less on the, kind of a systematic review of the different literature and get into some of the evaluations themselves. So let me introduce Maya Schling, who is going to present to us on the Andean context and the causal relationship between land tenure security and ag productivity. So some of the issues that we've been discussing. She's a senior economist and a researcher at the Inter-American Development Bank. Her background is in applied economics and with a focus on investigating the impact of land tenure security on ag productivity. And for that, actually at the World Bank, researching tax compliance and tax capacity in Latin America. So
That's not me, that last part.
Oh, well,
the tax compliant part.
It is in my briefing notes, so we'll have to change your bio online as well.
Don't want to, claim something that I haven't done.
Oh, that's too funny. We will take that. You'll have to write a note saying, please take that out of my bio.
Okay.
So ignore the last sentence.
Yeah,
and
always
just go
good
with
for me.
and go with that.
Well, good morning, everybody. Let me just pull up some issues with the presentation. So let me just pull this up. Okay. All right. So thank you so much for joining me. My name is Maya Schling. I collaborated on this study with my colleagues at IDB, Magalia Science and Juan Medios Matos. And we took advantage of the surveys that are being collected for all of our land regularization loans to try to, extract some more regional lessons learned, in this case on the effects on technical efficiency in agricultural production. So I'll jump right in with the motivation. And I think, I don't have to talk about this too long because I think we're all aware of the benefits or expected outcomes. But particularly for Latin America, increases in yields seem to really drive poverty alleviation and reducing food insecurity. Just an illustrative example of the inverse correlation between yields, which is the blue line, and prevalence of undernourishment, which is the red line. You can see as yields increase, the incidence of undernourishment has decreased. And particularly for Latin America, aggregate growth originating from the agricultural sector has been estimated to be 2.7 times more effective in reducing poverty than growth from other sectors. So, this provides some of the justification for why we try to promote growth in the sector. And as has been, highlighted since yesterday in this conference and in the two presentations already this morning, land is a key economic resource that is needed to promote economic growth and agricultural productivity, to access financial resources, extension services, etc. In Latin America, land tenure is still relatively insecure, especially in rural areas. It is comparable in terms of the incidence of tenure insecurity to what we can find in the African continent, according to data from Prindex. Looking at the Andean context, which, are the countries of Bolivia, Ecuador, and Peru, we still do find high incidence of tenure insecurity in rural areas. In Ecuador, 60% of farmers did not have property title. In Peru, 65% of farmers, 22. And in Bolivia, 30% of land still needed to be titled by 2016. So the theory of change that we used for the study, again, I think has been, already presented here. The immediate outcome that we would expect is the increase in perceived tenure security. And this would, in the short term, lead to, depending on the context, reduced risk of land conflict, increased access of credit markets to credit markets and enhanced efficiency of land markets, facilitating the sale and purchase of land and allocating it to farmers who can use it the most efficiently. And this would then lead to optimized investment decisions, optimized use of inputs, which would in turn, in the longer run, increase productivity and farm technical efficiency. I highlight some of these intermediate outcomes because we will be looking at those, or are able to look at those with our data. And then, even though conceptually this is sort of the theory of change that has been presented, the empirical evidence, as we again saw in the previous two presentations, are somewhat mixed. Again, depends very much on the context. Some find positive impacts, including colleagues here from the World Bank. Some find no causal impact, depending on the context. And then several studies have also highlighted that, the pre-existing, the customary traditional land regime in place really plays a moderating role in determining whether providing land title has these effects, and of course also whether or not there are certain binding constraints in the given context. A lot of studies have also relied on cross-sectional data and have not been able to use the methodological approaches that really allow them to estimate causal impacts. This is particularly true in Latin America. And we do expect there to be underlying endogeneity that may bias the impact estimate of tenure security on production decisions, which I will get into a little bit more. So the research question we are trying to answer is, what is the effect of formal legal title on technical efficiency, and whether this varies by country in the Andean context? The contribution here is that this will be the first causal analysis of this impact on technical efficiency for Latin America. We used very rich agricultural household data for 3 Andean countries and are able to provide a regional analysis. And we apply multiple empirical strategies to address this concern of underlying endogeneity. I will jump into the data that we used. So as I mentioned, IDB also has requirements for conducting impact evaluations for all of our loans, even though, for one reason or another, this doesn't always work out as expected. But nevertheless, in this context, we do have available several surveys that were collected for regularization programs in the region. So for Bolivia, this was the Rural Land Regularization and Titling Program that was only recently approved a few months ago, and for which we collected a baseline in 2023 with a sample size of a little over 2,200 farmers. In Ecuador, the National System for Rural Land Information Management and Technology Infrastructure, which is a mouthful, and this is why we refer to it as the SIC-Tierras program, was implemented between 2012 and 2019. A baseline and endline survey were collected in 2014 and 18 respectively with a sample size of 2,700 farmers. The impact evaluation is forthcoming this year. And for Peru, a baseline survey was collected for the 3rd phase of the Rural Land Cadastre Titling and Registration Program in 2019. This loan was unfortunately canceled due to some implementation and political issues, but we still have the baseline data at least to extract some lessons from this experience and from the country context in general. So in total, we have over 7,000 observations in the sample, and applied similar questionnaires in all of these country contexts that collected very detailed information on perceived and actual tenure status, land and characteristics, socio-demographic characteristics of the farmer households, as well as detailed information on the entire production cycle, including crop choices, use of inputs, etc. We did apply some sample restrictions for the purpose of our study. So we only included farmers that owned at least one plot and were actively engaged in agriculture or livestock activities at the time of the survey. We also excluded farmers that reported productivity levels above the 95th percentile, to avoid outliers biasing our analysis. And this left us with a little over 5,200 observations in total. On the right, you can see some of the basic descriptive statistics. I won't go into too much detail, of course, but this is just to highlight that we do see a lot of similarities in terms of the characteristics of the farmers, because it is, a region with similar climatic conditions that then imply similar crop choices, etc. But we do also see some differences in terms of the plot size in the different countries and productivity levels. Looking briefly at just comparing farmers that hold land title versus those who do not, without applying any sort of econometric analysis here, we do see some basic differences where titled farmers exhibit higher production volume, different use of technology, for instance, irrigation in some cases. So this kind of points to the fact that farmers who have title and those who do not seem to be different to some extent, which again highlights the fact that we would need to apply some, statistical adjustments or methodologies to ensure that we're really being able to extract the impact of land tenure on productivity versus, pre-existing productive differences between farmers that do or do not have title. And this brings me to the empirical approach that we use in this paper. So to start off, what we try to estimate here is the technical efficiency of the farm, which essentially is an estimate of how efficiently a given farm uses their inputs to produce a certain output relative to what the potential could be. This is a more comprehensive understanding of production than just looking at, how much volume was produced by a given farmer. What has been used consistently in the literature is the stochastic production frontier estimation, which essentially models output as a function of all of the inputs, including, fertilizer, land, labor, as well as the technical inefficiency parameter and random error. Here we use several approaches that have been, commonly used in the literature to try to correct any potential existing bias and really estimate a technical efficiency that is free of these underlying endogeneities. So we use 3 steps. First, we use the propensity score matching to correct for selection bias stemming from observable characteristics. So we match essentially observations or farmers that have received title and those who have not received title using observable characteristics. And then once that has been done for this matched sample, we apply a stochastic production frontier with a bias correcting selection model that was first proposed by Green. This is comprised of 2 simultaneous equations. First, the stochastic production frontier function, and then a selection equation that estimates the likelihood that a farmer exhibited full property rights, as presented in this equation, where D is the dummy variable that represents the likelihood of the farmer having formal title. And I should have mentioned that this 2-pronged approach of propensity score matching and the bias correcting selection model is something that has been applied by Boris Bravo-Reta and others in other contexts, so we do follow the literature here. And then lastly, we estimate a meta frontier to be able to compare the technical efficiency levels of farmers with title and without title, because they may be using different technologies as a result of having title or not. And the meta frontier allows us to estimate a common benchmark for these different technologies and these different groups. And it also allows us to differentiate between the effect of tenure security on the use of different input factors and technological change. So we use all of these steps to hopefully estimate a bias-free estimator of technical efficiency. And once we have done this, we actually get to estimating the impact of land tenure on technical efficiency with this equation, where TE is the technical efficiency of farmer household I, tenure is the binary variable that indicates whether the farmer household holds legal title to at least one parcel, and we also include a vector of sociodemographic and productive characteristics at the farmer household level. Okay, so let's jump into the results. Here briefly, I wanted to share the results of propensity score matching. We used one-to-one nearest neighbor with replacement mechanism and an incremental selection of variables for the matching that follows a methodology proposed by Emmons and Rubin, where we start with a set of base covariates and then incrementally include more variables until we get, the ideal fit. This did reduce our sample to 2,986 farmers, where we would have common support for each of the countries. We did conduct a propensity score matching for each country individually, and you can see that particularly for Ecuador and Peru, we got a good fit. We're still working on the fit for Bolivia. Since these are preliminary results, and you can see that the distribution, the overlap of the distribution is not as good as I would like it to be. The results here for the estimation of the stochastic frontier production, I present all of our specifications from left to right. They become more robust. The first 4 do not use a matched sample. And then we in the column 1 and 5 would be the conventional SPF versus the other 3 would be with sample selection. And I highlight here column 8, which is the most robust specification that uses the meta frontier with sample selection and the matched sample. And we do see, for all specifications, but for this one in particular, that all inputs to production have a positive and significant impact. And that land has, in terms of magnitude, is the most relevant input for the production function. So this confirms, that land is a relevant factor. And our parameters at the bottom also confirm that the sample selection model is appropriate because there does seem to be some underlying endogeneity. Next, I'd like to present the average estimated technical efficiency scores. Thank you. For our countries, and I'll direct you directly to the ones that are highlighted in red, which are for our most robust specifications. In general, we can kind of see that the technical efficiency scores are higher for farmers that have title versus those who do not. And that technical efficiency on average is relatively low, between 14 and 18%, depending on the country context and the specification. Here are the main results that we're interested in. What is the effect of holding title on technical efficiency? And we can see that across the board, they're statistically significant and positive. For the unmatched sample, we can see that there would be a downward bias of estimates, and for the matched sample, that they are slightly higher. Translating this into a percentage, on average, farmers with title are 38% more technically efficient than those that do not hold title, even though this will vary depending on the country context. And as I mentioned before, when we looked at the theory of change, we also did try to look at some of the potential mechanisms through which higher technical efficiency could be achieved. At the regional level, we see that access to credit was an important a mechanism, and we see that access to credit increases by about 40% if you translate the percentage points here. And that land conflict seems to be higher amongst farmer holding title, though this could be a result of the measurement of that variable, which captured land conflicts within the last 5 years, and a lot of these titles were granted or issued within that time period. So it's likely that during the titling process, some of these land conflicts would have come up and would likely have gotten resolved. And the mechanism will then, you can see that for Bolivia, productive investment is also, and for Ecuador, that productive investment was significantly higher. So you can see that the mechanism that will drive higher technical efficiency will vary by country, which is very much in line with the presentations earlier, that country context will be very relevant. So to summarize our preliminary findings, we do observe selectivity bias, which confirms that our empirical approach is necessary to control for this underlying endogeneity that may exist. The SPF estimates highlight that land is highly statistically relevant for determining production output, and that titled farmers on average have higher technical efficiency scores compared to untitled farmers. holding legal land title increases technical efficiency by 6 percentage points or 38%. And this holds at the regional level with some variation in magnitude by country. Some of the mechanisms that apparently drive this impact seem to be higher access to credit and increased productive investment. And this, for the Latin American and specifically the Andean region, confirms that comprehensive land regularization efforts are necessary to enhance economic growth in the region. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Maya. Okay, we have about 3 minutes for questions. We went a little bit over. Please in the back.
Hi, Pablo Molan from Tel Aviv University. I wonder if there's any variation in customer institutions in your sample and whether you can use that as a mechanism. And then the inputs that go into your output measure, are those location specific, and does that include things like management practices, for example, or is it just like raw inputs?
I didn't catch the first part of your question, variation in?
Customer
institutions. No. So the answer to your first question is we do not include a variable for customary institutions because in terms of quantitative variables, I think that would be, I can't think of a variable, at least off of the top of my head, that could be included. And within each country that also, I guess I would have to think about that a little bit more. For the second question, we do include different technologies. So for instance, the use of irrigation, the use of improved seeds. So we do use some sort of variation in the technologies used. I think managerial technology would be a bit harder to get at with the data we have available. Thank you.
Robert Helmer, University of California, Santa Barbara. I'm curious, so it sounded like you have some countries, I think Bolivia, where it's largely just cross-sectional pre-implementation versus Ecuador, where you actually have both a kind of baseline and an end line. Did you look at all at kind of comparing your results using the kind of temporal variation? I don't know if you actually have a panel for the Ecuador case, but how those kind of compare to doing the cross-sectional analysis, and if that gives you additional confidence in the robustness of the results for Bolivia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the regional analysis we do, with the cross-sectional data, but for, as you say, for Ecuador, we have the panel data. We did conduct the difference for that, and it confirms the results we find for Ecuador. I didn't include it for time reasons, but yes, where we have the panel data available, we try to use it.
Ben Linko, MCC. So if I'm understanding correctly, your measure of technical efficiency is essentially the level of output holding inputs fixed, right? At a given level of inputs, how much are you producing?
Mm-hmm.
And then increased technical efficiency is kind of a completely different effect from increased productive investment, right? Because productive investment means more inputs. So if that's the case, do you have any sense of how we would explain higher technical efficiency as an impact of land titling, or what that pathway could be?
So with regards to the productive investment, that was a question, that was a yes or no question that was posed to households, like whether or not they made any productive investment in their plot within the last year. So that doesn't necessarily measure higher levels of inputs.
Okay.
So we haven't yet gotten to the point where we're differentiating between, because as I mentioned, the meta frontier does allow us to differentiate between whether technical efficiency stems from, using more inputs or using a different technology. So that would be sort of the next step to kind of tease out what land tenure is really driving here.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Okay, one more quick question, then we have to switch to the other one. So
Looking from this University of Germany, I'm just curious, have you looked at any relationship between size and productivity in this analysis? How the farms have affected productivity? How does it look like? Just
Yes, farm size is included as one of the variables in the stochastic production frontier, and it does drive productivity, yes.
But I mean, how the curve looks like? Is it like U-shaped? Is it decreasing? Is it decreasing with 2%?
I would have to look at the data for that. I don't know that off the top of my head, but intuitively from what I know from the context, I would likely assume that it's going up. Yeah.
Okay, we are gonna bring back to the floor Heather Huntington for Mozambique. I'll skip the introduction since we introduced you earlier and let you jump right into the Mozambique impact evaluation, including the urban and rural components. With co-author Kate Markle, who happens to be in here as well, so she can jump in if she wants to answer questions.
Kate can let us know about the difficulty of collecting land administration data in detail.
Which she didn't have to do in any other countries either. Oh, Burkina too, that's true.
Okay. My presentation is too long, so I'm probably not going to get through it, but I will do my best to go through it without being too frantic. Okay, so I am going to present on the endline impact evaluation findings for the Mozambique Land Tenure Services Project. So this is kind of, I think, a nice end to our panel because we talked about reviews. Now we've talked about MCC evaluations from Ben, and then now we have one specific evaluation that we'll talk about. So this is for Mozambique. I will also just say that this is a very large, comprehensive evaluation. The report is available. It's like maybe 200 pages. So this is a sample of what we present in the report. If you're interested in all the details in the tables, please look at the report. This just kind of hits the high points. Okay, so what is a project? So this is one of 4 projects under the Mozambique Compact from 2008 to 2013. So we're looking at the land tenure intervention, obviously. And so 3 objectives: to improve land policies and regulations, improve the efficiency of land administration services, and to expand access to land use. So in terms of what that actually meant for the interventions, there was a policy activity that sought to do institutional strengthening at the policy level and to also push forward some policy reforms. There was a capacity building activity that was centered on the land administration system, and this was to basically build a land administration system within Mozambique and get that up and running. This system is called SIGIT. And then the third part was the site-specific activity, which is essentially the formalization. So this is a registration of the use and people's benefits to land through the DUOTs. These are formalization. This is a formalization moment, but in the de facto customary system, people already have the rights to land. So I'm not going to go into too much more detail because I assume everyone here is a land person and generally understands. We've got land administration system strengthening, and we've got the DUOT registration going on. This is the geographic area. So again, this is a complicated project and a complicated evaluation. But I will say here that the blue places are places where we have the capacity building and the land administrative strengthening going on. The red circles are where we are particularly interested from the evaluation standpoint in the DUOTs. Okay, so the evaluation data collection took place in a subsample of like the areas where the program was rolled out. Clearly, that was for budget reasons. Can't always cover the full project areas. So one of the things that the evaluation did, and that's kind of in line with what we've been talking about today, we looked at the implementation fidelity of the program, and we looked at how systematic the systematic registration was across the study area. So again, we are specifically talking about those red sites. We have urban sites and rural sites that are a part of the evaluation. And what you can see here is that these are the percentages of the areas that were covered in terms of the registration by the project. So in the urban area, we have 22% covered, 53% covered for this area, which was eventually kind of made not a treatment area. And then in the rural areas, we have 37% coverage and 69% coverage. These are our comparison areas. So this is by the time of the end line, how much sort of contamination, if you will, had happened in the comparison areas. So you can see that in Nampula City, we have, although coverage was kind of small, we have pretty low spillover, if you will, or contamination. Monaco Vio area in the urban site was basically just kind of treated, and we removed that from the evaluation sample. For the rural area, we have, this was kind of our strongest, cleanest comparison set here in Malema. And then for Mukufu, you can see that there was a lot of expansion of the DUA registration. Okay, so this is all important to keep in mind. We did analysis on like what factors led to differential uptake. And so that's all in the report, but our takeaway is that it is important to understand why some people actually end up getting the documents and some people don't get the documents, right? My slide got messed up here because there was supposed to be my little specifications for the regressions at the bottom, but that screenshot didn't make it in. So really quickly, we essentially, I'm going to present the kind of regression tables today, or not the tables, but the findings. And so we looked at two specifications. We looked at the intent to treat, and we looked at the treatment on the treated, right? Because if we go back here, a lot of people didn't actually get the treatment. So we wanted to see if there was a difference between sort of the general study area and the people who actually ended up getting the documentation. And the like takeaway is, yes, that's important to look at because it's different. But there's also selection into that, as we've highlighted with this presentation, as we've talked about before. So the people who actually get the documentation look different. So this evaluation covered quite a number of data sources. We had household data, household surveys. We also collected an end-line only survey for women decision makers, and we collected at end-line a community leader survey. So we had a lot of survey data to work with to help explain mechanisms and to look at for kind of context. We also had a number of qualitative data sources. We did collect these simultaneous to the quantitative data. So this is one of Ben's points, which I completely agree. Ideally, especially once you see the investment findings, to understand something that's an unexpected finding, it would have been wonderful if we could have done the quantitative analysis and then gone back to explore some of the weird findings. Unfortunately, we did not have the budget to do that. Also, COVID happened in the middle of this, so we were feeling pretty lucky just to kind of do it. But yes, that would have been fantastic. And then the other two data sources, one not on the screen here, we did look at geospatial data. We did have done an environmental analysis of forest condition cover, but I'm not going to talk about that today. And then we also collected land administration records. We digitized over 5,000 paper records, and then we completed these volume and transaction record logs with each of the offices. Kate led this effort, and so she has a lot of information about that. If any of you are interested in that, it's a very big undertaking to attempt that. Yeah, so those are our data sources. We had a number of evaluation questions that we were tasked with. So MCC wanted to know a lot about this study. And so today I'm just going to highlight some things from the green. But we did look at outputs. Ben, I hope that was on your list as one of those studies. So we have a whole chapter in the report if you're interested in the policy and the outputs. And then we looked at a number of these other outcomes. But today I'm just going to try to kind of hit some high points with the green. And I especially wanted to show some ways that we looked at the land administration data. So findings, a quick run through of some of our key findings. So there was a lot of variation in the sort of sustainability of the CIGIT and electronic system. So in many instances, despite all of this effort to build the system, people have reverted back to the paper. right? Why have they reverted back to the paper? There were a number of different reasons, but in many cases, there were problems with electricity, problems with the connectivity, lack of funding and training for the staff members. And then there was also just a general sense that people felt comfortable with the paper and they trusted the paper over the electronics, right? So we found in a number of systems, people were not really using the SIGIT system as it was designed to be used. In terms of the DUAT certificates, so we looked at kind of the efficiency of processing and how easy or not easy it was for people to get the DUATs. We found that although, there was an attempt to make the sort of sporadic registration when people wanted to go get a DUAT on their own, not as part of a systematic effort, we found that there were still lots of problems with that, right? So it still took more than 90 days to process, a little bit shorter in the urban areas, quite a long time in the rural areas. And it was just generally, I think, sort of too costly and too difficult for most people to do this, right? So if people were not being provided the DUAT certificate as part of the systematic, then the number of people who could actually go get one on their own was very, very small. And so, you would then find that the type of people who could actually do that were quite different than the general sort of citizen. And that makes sense, yeah? Okay. And then sort of to this point, we used the land administration data to kind of complement what we were seeing with the interviews and the qualitative. So these graphs basically just show that sort of the volume of DUAT applications is not great. So the blue line is the systematic DUATs. The red line is the sporadic. So this is the rural area and this is the urban area. So here's the end of the project. So you can see that the project had a bump in the rural areas because I worked on providing the DUAT systematically. And then it just died off, right? And then we have this other bump, which is actually government program that we're seeing here with this land administration data. But what you can essentially see is that in terms of the red line is just like a flat line for the sporadic, like people going and getting the DUATs on their own. We see more going on here in the urban areas, okay? So there's definitely more demand and more uptake in the urban areas. Although, again, for systematic, it's kind of flat lines, which I guess is good from a comparison standpoint because then we don't have contamination, but not the goal of the project, right? The project wanted to really see this go up. And then this shows some evidence of more formal transfers in the project area. So the control is the red line and the treatment is the blue line. And it's very small in the data, but you can see formal transfers are rare. If you look at the volumes on the y-axis, you can see that these are the formal transfers happening. So this was another project objective to really increase the transferring of the DUATs within the formal system. This is very low. Even though it's very low, it is happening more often in the treatment area. Okay, so moving away from the land administration, and now we're in the household data collection. What do we see here for some, I will try to slide through. I'm just gonna hit some highlights. This is the household outcomes that we were interested in. So really the takeaway here, we have a lot of differences between the urban and the rural. So as I flip through these slides, you'll see that in some cases, we get positive urban and negative rural and flip-flop. It really depends on the context. Not only does it depend on urban versus rural, but we also find variation between the Malema and the Mukufi set. We had to do some data wrangling in Mukufi because of that spillover issue, but even looking within two different rural sites that were relatively close, there's differences in how the project worked. So lots of important variation happening. So the project found different results for perceptions of land rights. For perceived tenure security, we find mostly null effects, although we do get more sort of consistent with urban. In the rural areas, we have one area where it was negative and one area where it was positive. These are pretty weak. These are not anything where we would really just like stake our claim in these. We did a lot of gender work on this. And so I will say that we have some really interesting gender findings if you're interested in those in the report. But essentially, if a woman's name was on the duat, we do find some evidence that she felt stronger tenure security, and she also felt stronger sort of intra-household bargaining. She had stronger inter-household bargaining responses for those outcomes. The issue was women were not always included on the certificate. So we also looked at when women were included. And this is important, an important sort of implementation moment. We found that in the general project area, the actual tenure security for female-headed households went down. When we took that and looked at just the women who were treatment on the treated group, that negative effect goes away. So our explanation was that essentially the project sort of had the potential to increase a little bit of tenure and security in places where my neighbor might have gotten a certificate and I did not get a certificate. And we have some qualitative results that speak to that as well. Our results for investments are negative pretty much across the board. We didn't have a great explanation for this. There's sort of, okay, maybe they can move resources away from certain like investments on the field because they have this increase in tenure security or property rights because they have the documentation. But in terms of why literally, the investment items are going down across urban and rural, we don't have a clear story. This is a place where if we could have gone back and done a qualitative study, it would have been awesome. But we didn't have the funds. That was not a part of what we did. Okay. And then I probably don't have much more time, do I, Jenny? 3 minutes. Okay. So land value. So we do have some positive effects of land value because the investment, findings weren't what people wanted to see. We spent a lot of time looking at some indicators that might indicate, rental markets or off-farm labor, et cetera. And so we did find some of the perceived land values going up. So people who have duats especially felt that their land was more valuable. We also looked at conflicts. Conflicts are quite rare. As Jenny has talked about, studying conflicts is quite difficult, especially when the conflicts are rare. So we really didn't pick this up very much in our sample. This is cross-sectional end line. There was a quote unquote, people felt less likely that they would experience conflicts. But again, the conflict data was quite challenging. So this is a measurement, really getting good conflict data is hard. We did use the land administration data to look at conflicts and especially sort of whether or not people were escalating any of these conflicts up to the land offices. And so what you can see with this graph is, again, the volume is quite low. You do see that there is a little bit of an uptick, a little bit higher number of conflicts being referred to the land offices. And we did experience that with our interviews and with the qualitative data as well, where people would say that there are certain type of conflicts that they would then take their documentation and go to the land office. I might just 1 minute. Yeah. Okay. Oh, I may make it to the end. Okay. We looked at differential effects. Again, to the point of people look different who get the documentation and people's outcomes vary. The report goes into a number of differential effects for women, youth, large landholders, et cetera. I will say that we did find a number of more positive effects with the larger landholders. So people who had more money, who were better off. We did see some of the expected effects, especially for investment. But for the aggregate sample and such, we didn't see that. So, this issue of what the constraint is for some of the people to actually engage in, let's say, investment. And then this is just a summary. Again, you have to read the 200-page report if you really wanted to dig into all of the findings. But that gives you a sense of what we looked at across and where we found kind of, the green or the red or the nothing.
So we have time for one round of questions. I would just make one correction, which is that the MCC project aimed to increase sporadic demand for registration for duets, but not systematic registration. So the blip that you saw in systematic registration was because the project issued titles for a certain period of time, largely at the very end of the project. And then as the post-compact period continued, you saw the government register certain titles. But of course, like it did continue registering until the government of Mozambique through the World Bank project increase the titling initiative again, which is why you saw that jump in systematic. Yeah, again at the end. So I'll open up the questions we have for one round of questions, and please introduce yourself. And
I'm Willie Governor from Terra Vital, and I also saw that the systematic registration in Mozambique was big. So I'd like to give you some insights as what happened afterwards. Actually, good to see what happened and where's it gone. But the focus there was more rural. But on the land administration side, the city is still not working. Okay, so and people don't trust it because it's not working. Hence the demand for paper-based documents, so they feel more comfortable and secure with a paper document as opposed to an electronic document. And access is not always. So it's a non-functioning system that was supposed to be updated or upgraded in the World Bank project, but it didn't happen in time. It's still going to have that perception of not believing in the system is going to create this negative belief in that. Hence the paper. And not all the paper documents, even in all of that, were actually delivered. So while the survey happened, people didn't get that at the end product, which is the paper duat type of things. Just on the urban side, what we found is when we went into these districts, and we worked in Nampula and Niassa, in areas where you had studied earlier as well, we found that the municipalities themselves in the urban areas were creating the biggest issue around non-registration and the delays, because they didn't want any form of systematic, even in urban, systematic titling, because they wanted to derive income from the titling of the urban parcels. So they were the stumbling block into a mass increase in urban areas, that's likely in those areas. And it's largely driven by political issues, as well as the fact that in some way, because of corruption, they all seem to on this bandwagon of getting some. I'm not going to say it publicly because I don't have, but there is an element of corruption that they derive income from titling these properties, so they delay the process so they can get a little bit of cash along the way to line their pockets to make the process happen.
And what do they call the titles that they were issuing? Is it
still the doors?
They still were calling them the okay. And is the political issue based on the sort of who was in charge and who was approving, or is this more, do you think?
And down the line as well, who's actually doing the practicing in the land administration offices in the various districts. But we found it to be the biggest hindrance that around security in urban areas. So they didn't really want to implement it, except in one area in Niassa where we did it, and the elections are coming up in October, and they wanted that before October. So that was also driven by the political, that if they were able to give the title, they were able to get the benefit at the election stage, for example. On the conflict side, why the level of conflicts is so low, we found there was very little evidence of boundary conflicts. So because they were very communal, and I guess it's more cultural as well, around issues, people worked and lived together. I mean, they lived together for years next to each other. They had settled their boundary issues amongst themselves over the years. And really didn't have boundary issues. But we found a lot of conflicts within the household itself around the ownership issue. So whether the husband, the wife, or the second wife, or the third wife, or even the children had any rights to the property. We also found in the country there that depending whether you were in the north or the south of the country, there was a big difference in terms of gender ownership of land. We found up to 60% in the southern areas, which is the Maputo and Gaza areas down the south, whereas in your study area where you were looking at, it was close to 40%. A very big difference in co-titling. So that we even found in single, where women only had title, was quite significant in the south as opposed to in. So you had co-titling, which sort of, but if you just took single title, the women themselves had title. It's quite high up in this.
And just to confirm, this was from the GIL, from the Innovation Lab continued study, or just the
No,
work
this
we
is
did
from, I was basically did some analysis
afterwards?
of the project that we did on the data that we did. So we had data for about 720,000 titles. It was a large data sample. And also we did community studies. We did, so what they did in Mozambique is in Mozambique, which is a good, very one of the, they did all the villages, the local villages, they planned the villages. So they did this sort of master planning for each of the villages. And in those areas, we found that the gender empowerment or the gender issues around women owning land was significantly higher than in areas where they didn't do what they call the DELCON, which is the land use planning. So if they were planned and the community was engaged and trained properly, so a lot of training went into these community forums around it. We found then the security of tenure, gender issues were dealt with, and conflicts were almost very high, the ratios. In areas where this didn't happen, it was significantly low.
Thank you for sharing the insights on the post project. It's always interesting to hear. Are there any other? I'm only aware of time that we have 2 more minutes. Are there other questions for Heather, please?
We have 1 hour break, so I'll say if you need 3 minutes in break.
Oh, okay, good. Spoken to the conference organizer herself, so I'm gonna, feel free, but we'll go a little bit over then, please.
Yeah, I have a question, maybe a more clarification about the CIGIT. I understood that, I mean, I can understand that the issue between having a paper document versus digital. I think it's completely understandable, but the CIGIT I understood is like a software system. So there was a problem also in adopting this system to processing in. Yeah, it's just because thinking about so I'm from Brazil and thinking about the experience we have there in developing and making agencies adopting systems, it takes like a long time. Like the best experience and we have at federal level. I mean, it's hard to only assess in the initial years because the systems keep getting updates and more functionality. So it's been like 10 years. Or for state agencies, it takes much more, 5-6 years to have a third version. So I don't know if I don't see this necessarily as a failure or a lack of adoption. Maybe it's much more like it needs time to really.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I think this also goes to our discussion of 5-year timelines, right, for projects. So the evaluation was tasked with looking at the sustainability of CIGIT. And so that's what we did. So the sustainability of CIGIT is not great at the time of the evaluation. I think there was this idea that, again, Mosland was going to be able to come in and pick it up and make improvements on it. But then COVID happened. Probably other things happened, but especially COVID. And so the government changed, like, 1 or 2 other things happened. So the expectation that there would be that continuation of support and revision of CIGIT didn't happen. So, I mean, I think this is to your point that I think all the donors know that CIGIT needs a significant, or the land administration system, however it is to be defined or designed, needs a lot of support. And there just wasn't that continuation of funding. And so I think now my understanding is they're still gonna try to. It's gone.
It's gone.
It's
so
gone. Okay.
So just to be clear, like, so the background audit is the government was on the design in the Mozambique, and which led to the follow-on with the World Bank. But the issue is that there was a system developed, and then afterwards there was no support at all to the urban level. So when you talk about the financing and development, the project got delayed, and so by the time that you implemented it and put in place, it was in the last year basically of the MCC compact when it actually got up and going. So if you don't have the same thing happen in Cabo Verde, in Mongolia, in Lesotho, in all these MCC projects where because of the delays of the project and the 5-year timeline, you had these systems going in place at the nth hour. And you always have delays and bugs. Those who've worked on land information systems, right? There's bugs in the system. You have to get them straightened out. If you don't have your developer there and with you, it goes to disarray. In addition to that, on top in Mozambique, the government only kept supporting the rural, and so did I forgot, was it the Dutch or whoever, but there was a provincial level support to continue CIGIT that did continue for the urban areas. So unless a mayor came in and said, yes, I will give you financial support to this land information system, like in Manapa, where they were quite willing to do a full cadastre and roll everything out. They just didn't have the funds or financing. So, I mean, Heather and I went there together, and the systems were like literally, like all the equipment was just laying in a box somewhere. And so MCC went back and did a whole study with LEI, Land Equity International, and I'm not sure who else, and I think there's a presentation of it at the land conference as well, talking about what you need to do to have these land administrations sustainable, because there's a lot, as you're saying, pointing out about capacity and buy-in and how to build these systems up, especially if you're setting up an entirely new system, which in this case is what there wasn't. You would sit there and these systems didn't have the electricity or internet, and nobody had ever used a digital system. It wasn't just upgrading the system like you did in Cabo Verde. It was a completely new digitization of all records, and that's what takes a lot of buy-in, right? So I'm sorry that's not on the evaluation per se and the impact.
Yeah, I didn't design it.
But the government asked for a new system, and
But I think
it didn't happen.
it was helpful for MCC for us to like break this down and show like this in a formal reports thing, even though yes, it's I don't think anyone expected it to be perfect after 5 years. The exposure period for this was 6 to 8 years. So yeah.
But it did give, I think in this one, it gives you an opportunity to see like what happens when you're looking at, okay, if you build a capacity of a land administration up, can you build the sporadic demand, and what's if somebody has a demand for title, are they more likely to invest? Who's somebody who's paying and going through that whole process to get a title, are they more likely to invest than the person who's getting a systematic title who may be in another area, right? And I think you saw this in the Lesotho evaluation that the World Bank, the DEC team did as well, right? Where people went out, and it wasn't the systematic registration, right? It was those people who, once you fixed the land administration system, went out, sporadically demanded titles. They were the ones who were investing, who were transferring, who were doing all this stuff, right? So I mean, it just comes back to like when you're looking at an evaluation, like are we, and we've talked about this in the land team in the World Bank as well, are we measuring the right thing? Should we be measuring the effects of systematic titling in some of these areas, or should we also be measuring all these land administrative reforms that we're doing and trying to get effects from that side as well? And I think some of these evaluations that MCC, that Heather worked on, that Ben and others and Kate worked on are trying to explore these issues a bit more. But any other questions before we head off to coffee? Much needed caffeine for those of you. So thank you so much for joining us at 8 a.m.